Animorphs! The TV show!
What?
Previously on Lord Ravenscraft, more or less, Animorphs is a frankly excellent, long-form war story about brain-infesting slugs and the kids and aliens who turn into animals to fight them. But also, owing to how it was distributed on a monthly basis, individual books were episodic, which allowed indulgent or experimental side quests like starfish-based evil twins or traveling back in time to hang out with dinosaurs. These stories existed alongside the more serious entries in the serialized sci-fi war story. There, I just saved you 2 hours. But please watch my videos anyway, I crave attention. I believe it's this episodic format that makes fans of the series convinced that if Animorphs can be adapted at all, it would be best adapted into a TV series. Like either a gritty HBO series or like Avatar: The Last Airbender, but with even more childhood trauma. Even Michael Grant said in the comments of my last video, it wants to be TV. We built it like TV. However, currently, Animorphs is instead set to be adapted into a movie by Picture Start. This movie, or possibly series of movies, will almost certainly center the overall war story, because there's not exactly time for the book where Rachel chases some Helmicrons into Marco's gastrointestinal system, only to get splashed with stomach acid which melts her eyes off. It's a lot. Disappointingly, Animorphs co-creators Katherine Applegate and Michael Grant have departed from the movie because they weren't, as Michael Grant put it, actually doing or contributing anything. So, whatever could happen with this series, it's doubtful there will be an Animorphs TV show. Again. In 1998, 2 years into the Animorphs book run, the series was turned into a live-action TV show starring, is that Shawn Ashmore? As in Iceman Shawn Ashmore? Lamplighter Shawn Ashmore? Jack Joyce from video game / TV show that's definitely not a gimmick, Quantum Break Shawn Ashmore? He's a baby! Anyway, Shawn Ashmore plays Jake, alongside Brooke Nevin, who plays Rachel, Boris Cabrera playing Marco, Nadia Lee Nascimento, who plays Cassie, Christopher Ralph playing Tobias, and the critically underrated Paolo Costanzo, who plays Axe. The series is not very well remembered. Even Michael Grant has dunked on the series as a poor adaptation, but okay, hear me out. Is it though? Okay, yes, it's bad, but the decisions that led to it being bad don't exist in a vacuum. Even if the people who made the show wanted to produce a faithful recreation of the books, and I think there's at least some evidence that they did, that doesn't mean they can. Technical limitations of the era, financial constraints on the production, and just the normal challenges of adapting complex media, for kids no less, can make it impossible to achieve that goal. Plus, you know, sometimes people just aren't very good at their jobs. I don't think it's enough to say that the show is bad. I want to examine why it's bad, and more specifically, which challenges the show creators overcame and which ones they failed to tackle. So, in this, the latest episode of the seminary thesis for the Animorphs degree I'll never get, let's take a look at the 90s Nickelodeon show, find out what went wrong, what went right, and what it can tell us about the expectations we have for adaptations of our favorite media. But first, some theory. Part 1. The adaptation. I have a puzzling quandary for you. What makes a good adaptation? This is a hard question to answer, and we're going to come back to it throughout the video, but I want to at least crack open the question before we start, because there's a natural tendency to think that what makes an adaptation good is just doing whatever's in the book. Just literally copy it. In his book, Film Adaptation and Its Discontents, film scholar Thomas Leitch argues that film analysis tends to treat movies and TV as though they are underlings to books, never able to exceed or surpass the material they're adapting, or even to exist independent of it. Adaptations can only either succeed or fail to execute the vision that the book lays out. As Leitch puts it,
studies of adaptation tend to privilege literature over film in 2 ways. By organizing themselves around canonical authors, they establish a presumptive criterion for each new adaptation. And By arranging adaptations as a spoke around the hub of such a strong authorial figure, they establish literature as a proximate cause of adaptation that makes fidelity to the source text central to the field.
Okay, so in human speak, that basically means we tend to treat the author as the one with sole authority over any adaptations. Like, it's literally baked into the word. What's in the book is what the author intended, and should be treated as instructions for anyone adapting the work to carry out. An adaptation is not some separate thing that can be considered on its own. It's not the artistic expression of the person or people making it. It is as dependent on the author's intention as spokes of a wheel are on the hub. Or at least, that's how we tend to treat them. Now, Leitch was talking about like academic, scholarly types, but that mindset clearly filters out to the rest of us as well. It's why when a movie based on a book is bad, we tend to judge its badness, at least in part, based on how closely it adhered to the book. But when an adaptation is fine, good even, we tend to overlook any differences to the book, and we much more rarely say the book was worse. The problem with this boss book mindset is that it privileges the book as a holy text, as though there's a collection of Dead Sea Scrolls that contain ancient Animorphs manuscripts that more closely adhere to the word of Applegate. It also kinda primes us to think that if something is bad, it must be because it didn't stick closely enough to the source material. Like, making changes to the text is the only way an adaptation can suck. Which...
Get those dogs, you fool! They might be Andalites!
The reality of creative adaptations is messier than that. In a later chapter of the book, Leitch lays out a model for categorizing adaptation choices. Now, I won't go super far into them, though I will list the 10 main categories and a few subcategories on the screen here for the pausers. But just to name a few, there are celebrations. These are adaptations that are exactly the kind of faithful recreations that we often envision when we picture an adaptation. These are movies that revere their source material so much, they may lift all their dialogue from the book or recreate the world as exactly as the book describes. There's parody and pastiche. Some of these are fairly obvious, like when a work is adapted with the intention of making fun of it, like Spaceballs, but also sometimes without the intention to mock it. The Orville, for example, is very clearly based on Star Trek, but it would be hard to argue it's mocking Star Trek. If anything, it just seems like Seth MacFarlane's Star Trek fanfic with the serial numbers filed off. Oh, here's a fun one. Neoclassic imitation. To super oversimplify, that's when you take a historical classic and update it to a more modern setting. 10 Things I Hate About You is basically Taming of the Shrew, but you wouldn't call it a bad adaptation just because there was no such thing as high school in Shakespeare's day, right? Now, I should say that at the end of this chapter, Leitch admits that these categories can't neatly contain every kind of adaptation, because, for example, Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet basically uses all of them. So instead of thinking of these as categories that a whole work fits into, instead think of them more as lenses that individual decisions on an adaptation can go through. Sometimes, for example, a movie will choose celebration, like when Lord of the Rings ended on the same iconic line that the book ends with. Or it can choose to use adjustment. This allows for more creative changes to a book in order to make it make more sense for the medium it's being adapted to. Like when Sam says that line in a very not scoured Shire that Saruman took over, because this thing is already 3 hours long and we need to go. Speaking of getting the hell on with it, I think that's enough theory for now. We've got a basic idea of how to analyze an adaptation, not purely based on how closely it adheres to its source material, but rather how it chooses to deviate, what informs those choices, and, as we'll see, how well the adaptation is capable of executing on those choices. So, with all that in mind, is the Animorphs TV show kinda good actually? To find out, I assembled an elite panel of the only vaccinated people I could find who were willing to sit down and watch multiple episodes of Animorphs with me. Zachary Vaudo, once again bringing his extensive knowledge of Animorphs lore, and, as a control group, Eli Thunder, who has only passing familiarity with Animorphs as a book series and has never until this moment seen a single episode of the show. For obvious reasons, we couldn't sit and watch every episode, although, dear viewer, I have. I've watched them all. My brain has devoted precious energy to creating new neural pathways in order to store the memories of... This is my life now. But anyway, I only made them watch a few select episodes, so let's take a look at Part 2, the episodes. I chose a cross-section of episodes that I felt were representative of the overall tone and strategy of the show. The episodes I chose were The Escape. This was the 7th episode of the show, originally aired in the US on October 16th, 1998. It was not based on book number 15, also called The Escape, but rather it was based on book 17, The Underground, which was released in March of 1998. Yes, you heard that right. This episode came out 7 months after the book it was based on was published. Next, we watched The Capture, a two-parter in the middle of season 1, based on book number 6 of the same name. Finally, we watched My Name is Eric. No relation. The second episode of season 2, and one of the last episodes of the series. This episode was based on book number 10, The Android. We started with The Escape.
So this is the oatmeal one.
This is the oatmeal one. In this episode, the Animorphs are in, like, a 1950s diner or something, where they spot another customer losing his absolute shit over some oatmeal.
I just need another bowl of oatmeal.
Like I said, no can do.
At first, they just think it's odd until they notice that he grasps at his ear. Yeah, that's how they keep indicating that there's a yerk, is someone keeps clutching their ear.
It just makes it look like they have swimmer's ear.
Rachel and Marco decide to break into the mental institution the man is taken to after his outburst.
I'm in.
I'm in.
Just once I had to say I'm in before Rachel did.
Which is a line from the book.
That's so Marco! When they break in, they encounter... Getting kitty. Okay, mini side rant time. Can we just stop doing this? Just stop it. Don't do this anymore. Don't do it. At all. It's... Stop. They talk to the man, George Edelman, and he explains... There is a specific flavor of oatmeal, instant maple, that is like a drug to yerks. When the host eats it, the yerks become addicted and lose control over their host. This also has the side effect of removing the yerk's need to leave the host's brain every 3 days. The host is kind of free, but now cripplingly addicted to oatmeal. Worse, the human experiences the yerk's withdrawal symptoms, and even in the best of situations, they're stuck with a yerk in their brain for the rest of their life. The Animorphs debate how to use this advantage.
I don't know, something just doesn't feel right.
What? We have a secret weapon here.
We have a weapon that messes people up. Bad.
Marco is all for it.
They're yerks. They're the enemy. They attacked us, not the other way around, remember?
But Jake points out the moral problem with accepting collateral damage to win a war.
Would I do this to my brother Tom? He'd be free. He'd have a yerk in his brain forever. I couldn't do it. Isn't some freedom better than none? During the Civil War, they were fighting to end slavery. How did they do that? By killing the slaves? No, by going after the slave owners.
Did this Nickelodeon show just invoke slavery during the Civil War to make an argument about going after the powerful rather than the victims of the powerful? Yo, this show rules. This is a kids show. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the episode ends with the kids taking water balloons full of oatmeal down to the yerk pool where Visser 3... I swear, most actors go their whole life without having as much fun with a role as this guy is having. Visser 3 says that he's willing to sacrifice 1,000 yerks to catch the Andalite bandits, so they pelt him and the pool itself with water balloons that very clearly don't pop. They're not popping.
Yeah.
What?
You gotta, open them first or something.
And then the episode just kind of ends. They run away, and Rachel does a bit of narration.
Nothing matters to Visser 3. We're not like that. We care.
And that's it.
There's a lot more combat that could have happened. There's a lot more morphing that could have happened. And when you don't deliver on that...
Yeah, it felt very anticlimactic.
Right.
It did try to raise the issue of, like, what are we willing to do to our enemies?
And that element... That element of the show was fantastic. It actually touched on a deep philosophical argument about wartime.
Yeah.
And then just didn't deliver on the rest of the Animorph stuff.
Yeah.
And that's why I feel like the show didn't stick.
Yeah.
Because it couldn't deliver on the stuff that you actually came to read the books for, which is kids turn into animals, they fight aliens as animals.
Then we watched the 2-part episode, The Capture. The first episode opens on a wholly new scene, not in the book at all, where Jake is at dinner with his family, including Tom, a known controller, when Visser 3 in Human Morph shows up and joins them. And before we even get to the plot, we are blessed with what might be the best scene in the entire series. And, by the way, I will warn you, I did not add music to this.
Mr. Trent, would you like to try some escargot?
Thank you, no, I'm actually allergic.
Oh, what's the matter? Look too much like the yerk in your brain? You know what? I'll try some. So starved even snails look good.
I don't think this was in any book.
No. It wasn't. It should have been.
Oh, he looks so sad!
This is brilliant. Catherine, Michael, I'm so sorry. This should have been somewhere.
Anyway, Jake gets recruited to work at his dad's clinic, where he spends his time on the line.
How did they manage to make AOL look worse?
Chatting with his friends who are hanging out in an internet cafe, Siberia. Here, Axe is being his most Axe.
Oh.
How many takes of that did they make you do, Paolo? While working at the clinic, Jake learns that their state's governor, a presidential candidate, will be coming by for a visit. The clinic has started installing a lot of extra security, so the Animorphs assume something is up. They decide to break in to prevent the governor from getting infested. A Herculean task that will require some incredibly complex computer hacking.
Marco, you rent movies.
Yes, but not now, Axe.
Marco, show me your video card. Rub it across my fur. To demagnetize it.
What?
Now give it to me.
Guess I won't be renting any more movies.
I've encrypted the card.
Okay.
What?
It will now match any human security code.
What?
Okay.
So, using the Blockbuster card Axe hacked with his nipple, the Animorphs break into the clinic and discover a miniature Yerk pool. Visser 3 plans to infest the governor by calling the Yerk pool a hydrotherapy, I guess. Meanwhile, the Animorphs end up stuck in the air vent right above the pool when they turn the AC on. They morph back to human just before they get blown away, but contrary to what John McClane would tell you, air ducts aren't really designed to support the weight of humans. So, Jake crashes through the ceiling. He falls straight into the Yerk pool. They manage to escape after Rachel morphs into a lion and... there we go! Oh, the mouth! Oh!
There we go. That's all we needed.
Look, canonically, morphing looks horrifying in the books, but not like this. Right before the team meets up outside, and Jake grins into the camera. He was in the tank too long, and now he has a yerk in his head. On to part 2! Just like in the book, Axe figures out that Jake is a controller almost immediately, partly from the thinly veiled look of disgust on his face when confronted with an Andalite, but also the dreaded itchy ear. This is actually how it happens in the book.
Yeah.
But I think in the book, Axe is in Andalite form, and so he
Yeah.
whips his tail blade to his throat, which, God, I wish we could see any tail blade whipping.
They've got knife tails?
Yeah, they have knife
Oh, yeah.
tails.
Mouth, feet, computer hands, knife
tails.
tails. What else is gonna fucking Andalite?
The team decides to keep Jake in the barn for 3 days, while Axe morphs Jake to cover for him at home, which goes just perfectly.
Axe, you've got to get your mind off of food, man. The human guys also think about sports and girls.
Look what I found on the sports channel. Girls lifting weights. Would you like to watch?
Not particularly.
He hit all the points. He hit every point that Marco told him about.
At one point, while tied to a chair in the middle of the night, Jake's yerk asks Cassie if she remembers when we first met.
Do you remember the first time we met?
Of course I do.
And that snake escaped in Mrs. Leitch's class. Everyone was running around screaming. And you caught it like it was nothing. Ever since then, I knew you were special.
Oh.
That's
It's low. Because they haven't even admitted how they felt about each other. Now Yerk is just pulling out Jake's memories.
And it's around now we get to see how the show gets around the whole Yerk talking to Jake in his own head problem.
You see that, Yerk? They're not buying it. No matter what you tell them. No matter what you make my body do. You're gonna lose.
We'll see about that.
Whoa. Whoa.
50 Shades of Yerk.
When that doesn't work, the Yerk starts lashing out at Tobias.
Bird boy. How does it feel to be trapped in the body of a filthy scavenger? To be trapped inside the body of a hawk? Never to be anything more to Rachel than a pet.
Damn, dude. Finally, the Yerk tries to escape by morphing, only for the Animorphs to reveal that they've been watching, waiting for the Yerk to try. Conveniently, the Yerk waits until the end of its 3-day feeding cycle, and right when the other Animorphs confront Jake, the Yerk dies and slithers out of Jake's head. The episode ends when Jake, now with an intimate understanding of what it's like to have a Yerk in his head, decides to pull a risky move. He has Axe rig up a voice changer, and he calls his brother Tom to tell him,
"Don't give up, Tom.
No matter what it tells you, no matter what it makes you do.
Don't give up. You're not alone."
I'm sorry, I only just noticed this in editing too, but can I also harp on what a great choice panning specifically to Rachel here is? Like, Tom's her cousin too, and it would have been easy to put like Cassie or even just the whole group here, but Rachel's the one that belongs right here. It's such a good choice. Okay, I'm done. Moving on.
I feel like if they had made more episodes, 2-parter episodes, they could have captured a lot more, because that one really hit on every key point of the book.
Yeah, those moments, like that moment with Jake and Cassie wouldn't have fit in a 25-minute episode.
Yeah, the pace was way better in this episode.
Next up, there's My Name is Eric. For reasons I can't figure out, this episode starts with Marco running in the woods and getting attacked by a dinosaur, only to wake up with a horse in his face? Sure, why not? Marco then wanders over to Axe, who is following along with a yoga instructor on TV.
By performing the art of yoga, one can meld the heart and mind together to create a wholeness. We'll be right back. We'll be right back.
After these messages.
So this sets up a recurring joke throughout the episode where Axe imitates whatever he happened to be watching on TV at the time.
That's right, sports fan. The Animorphs are coming to bat.
We are going to talk about you later. Marco and Jake then decide to go to the movies. However, the tickets for the movie they want to see are sold out, so Marco and Jake morph mice to sneak in. And then they make the incredibly smart and good decision to climb on top of some poor girl's nachos, which rightfully gets them flung across the room.
They used all of their special effects budget on a nachos joke.
Then an usher comes by and scoops up Marco in a dustbin and throws him in the dumpster. Just toss out the whole man. Mouse. Whatever. Jake catches up with Marco outside, where they see a kid from their math class, Eric King, run in front of a moving car to save a dog. He does like the full-on Superman thing, punching the dude's radiator with his own spine, before casually walking away. This understandably raises the Animorphs' alert level. They need to find out whether this guy is a Yerk weapon or not, so Marco and Jake morph dogs to investigate. This guy seems to like dogs, right? And they discover he has no scent. The team tries to figure out what this means, but before Rachel's done making fun of Marco for being baffled that a teenage boy doesn't smell, Eric reveals himself in the rafters. You see, Eric isn't a human at all. He's a member of a race of androids called the Chi. We don't have time to get into it right now, but I'm thinking maybe I'm going to do a standalone video explaining the whole Chi thing, so if that happens, I'll add a clicky thing here or something. Eric explains that the Chi look like two-legged wolves, and dogs kinda look like that, so that's why he likes dogs so much. Yes, book readers, we will get to how much that's a dramatic oversimplification in due time. Then, Eric tells them that the Yerks have stolen a piece of Chi crystal technology that allows them to create hyper-realistic holograms, the same ones the Chi use to disguise as themselves, and they're planning to use those holograms to snatch up humans right out in public and infest them without being spotted. The Animorphs decide they have to get the Chi crystal back before they can use it. Eric helps them devise a plan to get the crystal back, and they return to the warehouse where they saw it being tested. Jake asks Eric if he could take out a couple guards, but Eric says he's programmed for non-violence.
Now you tell us?
Rachel, being Rachel, decides to take matters into her own hands.
I'm going for it.
By morphing a monkey to sneak up and grab the crystal. Eric creates a diversion by inventing Prop Hunt close to a decade before it was created for Gary's mod, and Jake morphs a tiger on a green screen to chase off the remaining guards. The three of them run out into some woods of indiscriminate proximity to their previous location, where they meet up with Axe, who has some sci-fi nonsense strapped to his back. He turns it on, and they all disappear in a hologram. After they get away, they meet back at the barn, where Marco asks if Eric will help them fight the Yeerks. Eric says,
I mean, I'm still programmed for non-violence. I'm gonna fight the Yeerks. I'm gonna have to do it my way.
To which Marco replies,
That's cool, man.
It's fine. We'll get to that. Meanwhile, Axe shares that he too has learned a lesson.
I've learned that the real world is far more interesting than television could ever be.
That's right, Axe. Television is just a scam to keep your attention long enough to stick a bunch of ads in front of your face.
And now a word from our sponsors.
Please, I just need another bowl.
Like I said, no can do.
You don't understand. I've got this sluggish feeling in my brain. It's executive dysfunction. Sometimes I get too overwhelmed or brain problemy to do the complex task of planning out a whole meal, so that's where this video's sponsor, Vite Ramen, comes in handy. Each packet is like one of those meal replacement drinks, except it's actually food. Each packet has up to 31 grams of protein, as well as a bunch of nutrients you'll see on screen. I don't know what most of that means, but I talked to a friend who's a bit of a nutrition expert, and he was like, yeah, I'd eat that. For me, it's more important though that I can make a meal fast. Otherwise, I'm gonna be tempted to hit a drive-thru or, more likely, just miss a meal. Depression can be like that sometimes. So it's cool that Vite Ramen packs cook as quickly as other ramen in just 3 minutes. The packs with flavoring average out to around $5 to $6 a pop, which is a fair amount for ramen, but it's cheaper than fast food, and the company makes a point to pay their workers decently. You can also get naked nudes for closer to $2.50 a pop and bring your own seasoning. Use the coupon code LordRavenscraft and you can get 10% off your order. Oh, and get this. One of Vite's co-founders' first Animorphs book was the one with the oatmeal. Like, I thought I was pushing it by telling them I would make a comparison to alien brain drugs with their product, but they were like, nah, we love that book, go for it. Pretty cool, guys. And now, back to the show. Part 3, The Changes. So, alright, let's do some reading. We've seen the episodes, but let's take a look at how closely they adhere to the books they're based on. Starting with The Escape, based on book number 17, The Underground. It's honestly fairly close to the book, with most changes made for either practical or legal reasons. The book opens when George Edelman jumps out a window and the 6 kids in various bird morphs catch him in mid-air and glide him to a nearby river. A scene the TV show skips for what I hope are obvious reasons. This is also the book where the Animorphs discover a secret entrance to the Yeerk pool inside a McDonald's, which they discover they can access by using the secret order, I'd like a Happy Meal with extra happy. Presumably to avoid infringing McDonald's trademark, the show changes the location to just some random fast food joint and changes the line to I'd like a cheeseburger, hold the cheese, which this guy responds to with absolutely zero chill.
We'd like 4 cheeseburgers, hold the cheese.
Hold the cheese?
Hold the cheese.
These, and frankly most of the changes we'll look at today, would fall under Leitch's adaptation category of adjustment, which is, again, making changes to a book or source material to make it more appropriate for the medium it's being adapted to. In this case, television. This category is extremely common, and so it has a lot of subcategories to it, and one is just budget. As Leitch put it, sometimes the crucial force behind an adaptation is the accountant. But all of these so far are minor details. For the most part, the episode follows the book pretty closely, and many other details in this episode are straight out of the book. That moment where Marco says, I'm in first.
I'm in.
I'm in.
That's taken straight out of chapter 26. Even the discussion of slaves is in the book, although it's a little different. So, Tobias asked him, what's your answer? Jake shrugged. In the Civil War, they were ending slavery. Most of the Southern soldiers who were killed weren't slave owners. They were just guys trying to be brave. Maybe they could have worked out a compromise. Maybe they could have ended the war earlier if the North had agreed to leave some people as slaves. But would that have been right? No. So the war had to go on till everyone was free. So I actually think I like the show's version better. This choice is more in the adjustment subcategory of correction, where an adaptation makes a change specifically to improve on the source material. In the book, the kids eventually come around to the idea that they don't have to go after the human hosts, they can feed the oatmeal to the Yeerks directly, but it kind of comes out of nowhere once they already get to the Yeerk pool. Cassie just kind of has a light bulb moment, like, oh wait, we don't have to just mindlessly accept collateral damage that we cause. Now, I get what the book is going for here, they're trying to just like not automatically end up at the right answer immediately, but it doesn't totally land for me. The discussion up to this point in the scene in the book is about how you can't compromise with the Yeerks. It's kill or be killed. Spoiler alert, actually yes you can, it's basically how the whole series ends. Cassie was right the whole time and y'all gotta stop defending genocide in my comments. But okay, compromising with the enemy wasn't the issue here. The issue is the means by which you win, and how much damage those means cause. Maybe you could make the argument that some damage is inevitable, and sure, okay, but there's such an obvious answer here that even the book gets around to it eventually. Don't go after the people who are being harmed. Go after the powerful people doing the harm. This also contrasts better with Visser 3's willingness to sacrifice his own Yeerks in order to catch the Andalite bandits. He's the villain, and he doesn't care how many of his own people he hurts or kills in order to win. If the Animorphs are willing to do the same, what makes them any better? I can appreciate that in the book they wrestle with the idea instead of landing on the right answer immediately, but I still don't think, oh wait, I literally hadn't thought of that, is a satisfying way to answer an ethical question. The show's correction here improves the story, so points to the show. Not only for being willing to tackle the question, although I will once again remind you, this aired on Nickelodeon, but for doing a decent job of conveying the point more succinctly than the book. Anyway, this episode is about fucking oatmeal. I got a few responses to the past couple videos asking why I hadn't brought up this plot yet, and this is why. Because against all odds, and as entertaining as it is, Yeerks getting addicted to instant maple and ginger oatmeal is somehow the least interesting part of this story. The Capture, based on book number 6, The Capture. Like The Escape, this episode is actually a surprisingly accurate representation of the events of the book it's adapting. Some of the specifics are changed. In the book, for example, Jake just overhears Tom calling doctors on the phone, but in the show, Jake's father is involved in running the clinic that the Yeerks are attempting to take over. But the main story beats are largely the same. That is, except a few key differences. First, there's the absolutely fantastic scene of Tom and Visser 3 struggling to sit through a snail dinner. I will take no questions. When you're doing sci-fi on a budget, camp is your best friend, and this is campy as hell. I love it. And then there's...
Rub it across my fur.
Look, we all make choices in life. The scene where the Animorphs decide what to do with Jake is also a little smoother in the show. In the book, it takes about a chapter and a half for Axe to realize Jake is a controller first, and then convince all the others. Which happens pretty easily when the Yeerk in Jake's head says, "Get your hand off of me, Andalite filth." The show cleverly skips this bit, which leaves room for some ambiguity and tension. Yes, we know Jake is a controller, but the other Animorphs don't know for sure. That enables us to have that scene where Jake tells Cassie how special she is, which is pretty gut-wrenching. In the book, Jake's Yeerk almost immediately tries several times to morph and get away, which gets a little repetitive, but the show has to keep morphing to a minimum. But, you see, that creates an opportunity to make the character moments stronger. Jake's Yeerk taunts Cassie with the feelings they both try to pretend they don't have. It also insults Tobias by saying he'll never be more than a pet to Rachel. It's cruel and harsh, but it's engaging. You feel the threat of the Yeerk more intimately. It's not just that the Yeerk takes away Jake's free will, it's also willing to use his memories as a tool to hurt and alienate his friends in its quest to defeat them. It's terrifying stuff. This is, I think, a great example of how a budgetary adjustment can actually force a corrective adjustment. Every additional scene with a morph would have cost more to shoot, but putting the actors in a barn and having them talk costs very little. The added constraints forced the show writers to create new scenes, and the scenes they created ended up improving the focus on the story's underlying theme. That's not to say that it wasn't present in the book, but it's just clearer here. There's also another scene we get that isn't in the books, but is described in the books. The parts where Axe pretends to be Jake.
This stuff is on my top 10 food list.
Since the books are all written in first person, we never actually get to see this. Now, it's not exactly a big brain 400 IQ decision to include these scenes, but also a strictly literal adaptation approach where you have to go exactly by the book and nothing else wouldn't include this scene. It wouldn't include the hilarious slug scene. And it also could have ruined the best scene in the whole set of episodes. At the end of both the book and the episode, Jake calls his brother Tom. Making this phone call is a risk, so obviously he would have to disguise his voice. In the show, Axe rigs up a voice modulator, the normal way, not using his magic alien computer nipples. In the books, however, Jake partially morphs a wolf. Now don't get me wrong, that sounds metal as shit, but also, I don't know that it translates to the screen very well. I feel like it would take away from the moment. In the best case scenario, it's one extra thing to process. You'd be reacting to seeing Jake with a wolf throat, and all the many, many questions and disconcerted feelings that raises, right before the story tries to have a tender moment with his brother. Plus, for this adaptation, we've seen what their morphs look like. It's a good change that's realistic about the limitations of the show's effects and cognizant of the emotional mood of the scene, which is where the focus should be. This episode shows how emotionally torturous it is to watch a Yeerk use your own memories, your own mouth, to manipulate the people you care about. And now, having experienced the harsh reality of what Tom is going through, he reaches out to make a connection with Tom, to give him hope. I unironically think this episode is a little bit better than the book. The changes it makes help streamline the story and keep the focus on the relationship between the characters. Jake's friends help support him even when the Yeerk in his head is forcing him to lash out. Wow, that's a metaphor I'm going to bring up with my therapist later. And once he's back to himself, he can extend that same support to his brother. The book has all this too, it lands a little bit better for me in the show. And it doesn't hurt that this being a two-parter lets this episode breathe more than some of the other standalone episodes. My name is Eric, based on book number 10, The Android. Of the episodes we watched, this one is the most substantially changed from the book, and I gotta admit, it's in ways that are a pretty big letdown. Both the book and the episode have multiple scenes of the team figuring out who or what Eric is. In the book, they discover Eric doesn't have a scent while in Dogmore first, and later he smashes into a bus, where the show does these scenes in reverse. But that part's fine. Sort of. I don't think either version is very good necessarily, especially when you realize how much of the plot happens in the back half of the story, but at least the book's version is a slightly more natural escalation. I don't know, it's fine. However, this is one of the dangers of adapting a story verbatim as it exists on the page. The book has at least 3 separate scenes of investigating or discovering information about Eric, one says dogs, one says birds, and a final one as a tarantula. That's a lot of discovery that could be condensed. Even in the show, where it's only 2 scenes, it takes up nearly half the episode. Now, I'll give the book this, they're all fun scenes to explore animal morphs, but the show doesn't have that kind of budget. This is where another subcategory of adjustment, compression, would have come in handy. Most book adaptations have to shrink their stories, reducing the amount of moving parts and streamlining plot moments. Here, the show could have done that more. Maybe just have one scene of discovering Eric, or cut a lot of the extra stuff at the movie theater, or Axe's TV obsession. But by being too faithful to the book, this first half of the episode ends up less good. The book can have a lot more scenes of discovery because it's okay to take hours to read a book, but for this 22-minute episode, there just isn't time, and you're already wasting it. Up until this point, I wish the show had changed more from the book, but it's not until Eric is revealed as an android that the real changes in the show appear. Most of what I'm about to describe is cut from the show entirely, to I guess make room for all of these scenes. In the book, Eric takes several of the Animorphs to his home, which has a secret, massive underground cavern, and I'm sorry, how many of these are under the city? Like, did the Chi lair have a zoning conflict with the Yeerk pool at all? What is going on here? Anyway, in this lair is a giant dog park. Eric reveals that the Chi were created by a race of peace-loving aliens, the Pemalites, who merged their essences with wolves to create dogs. If you've ever wondered why dogs are just unendingly happy and love to play and have fun and never seem to have a care in the world, it's because of the Pemalites. This backstory is thoroughly glossed over in the show, instead leaving it at, we're robots who like dogs. In the book, though, it was the Pemalites who programmed the Chi to never commit any acts of violence. Even though they are incredibly powerful and have existed on Earth for thousands of years, hiding through the use of their holograms, they've never been able to lift a finger to harm anyone. If they want to fight injustice, they have to do it through non-violent means, which is what Eric is doing by trying to infiltrate the Yeerk front organization, the Sharing. Now, in the book, this whole non-violence thing isn't sitting well with Marco. He's still wrestling with the recent revelation that his mother isn't actually dead, but is a controller. The primary reason he's still fighting, still risking his life on a regular basis, is to save her. Meanwhile, these literal deus ex machinas are sitting on the sidelines when they could be helping. For him, it's not just that he resents them living in an idyllic dog park while a war rages around them, it's that by refusing to join the fight, the Chee are condemning his mother, specifically to a life as a Yeerk slave. You could help stop it. Why won't you? In the show, however, we get this exchange.
If I'm gonna fight the Yeerks, I'm gonna have to do it my way.
That's cool, man.
It's what? Marco is the one who's okay with it? I could get that from Cassie, maybe, but Marco? Even the TV show version of Marco knows that his mother is a controller by this point. Why would Marco say this? This is such a substantial change from the books. And look, I get it, I don't like it, but okay. In the books, Eric wants to fight. He actually agrees with Marco. He argues with the other Chee that they should get the Pemalite crystal that the Yeerks are holding, rewrite their programming to allow for violence, and join the Animorphs. Marco, who is all for this plan, gets confronted by another Chee named Maria.
You don't understand. Chee do not hurt. Chee do not kill. No Chee has ever taken a life. She grabbed my arm and looked right in my eyes. While humans and Yeerks and Andalites and Hork-Bajir and a million other species on a million worlds warred and slaughtered and conquered, we remained at peace. Would you end all that? Would you make us killers too? Yes, ma'am. I guess I would.
So, okay, maybe that can't go in a Nickelodeon show. I mean, it could. It's in a kid's book, but yeah, I can imagine that pitch meeting didn't go over very well. But at the same time, if you don't get that conflict, then you can't really do what happens next. In the book, the Animorphs do try to get their hands on the crystal, but it has nothing to do with stopping some hologram plot. The Yeerks have some vague plan about rewriting Earth's computers or whatever, but for the Animorphs, the explicit goal is to get the crystal so that the Chee can commit acts of violence and help them fight the war. They succeed in getting the crystal, but they get their absolute ass handed to them on the way out. Marco is bleeding, on the brink of death, when he just barely manages to get the crystal to Eric, right before he blacks out. When he comes to, all his friends are alive, and none of them look happy about it. Eric had saved them all by single-handedly killing over 24 Hork-Bajir and an unknown number of human controllers. All beings that, but for the Yeerks in their heads, probably would have been peaceful. And he wiped them all out in a matter of seconds. Even Rachel is crying. Eric asks Marco how he lives with the memory of what he's done. Marco says he just tries not to think about it too much. Over time, the nightmares get easier to live with. But Eric is an android. His memories don't fade. For as long as he lives, the grim memory of what he's done will be as fresh as the day he first did it. The harsh reality of what Marco asked Eric to do hits him.
What if I could never forget? What if all those moments were fresh forever? I realized then why the Pemalites had forbidden their creatures to kill. The Chee lived forever. Forever is a long time to remember what Eric had done. I'm sorry, I said.
Eric changes his programming back, resuming his ban on violence, and offers to only help with information from now on, but never violence. Never again. That shit is probably too heavy for Nickelodeon. And I get that. But also, this is a moment where the spirit of the story is lost. Unlike The Capture, this episode more or less abandons the central theme of the book by deciding to become more kid-friendly. That single decision ripples out through the rest of the episode. It has to create the hologram generator plot from whole cloth. It indulges in more scenes from the book than maybe it needed to because it has to pad out the runtime. And it avoids the morally gray question underlying the story, which in a series like Animorphs is kinda the whole point. Some of the decisions made after the choice to eliminate this super adult theme aren't even that bad in context. You know, once you take it for granted that you can't use the plot where an android with the joyous soul of a dog commits like 50 murders, but that single choice did effectively torpedo anything that came after it. At that point, there's only so much you can do. It is telling, though, that this is the first time we've come across a major thematic change that actively made the story worse. And even then, it's kinda reasonable, even if it's disappointing. That doesn't necessarily make the show good, but I think it also somewhat refutes the idea that the show creators didn't understand the books. So if that wasn't the problem, what was? Part 4, the analysis. So based on everything we've seen so far, it doesn't actually seem like the show is that much different from the books. Like, yes, they make changes here and there, but the plots are fairly similar. The episodic nature of a TV show allows it to adapt individual books more or less unchanged without having to weave together multiple storylines from separate books. Now, I don't want to give the impression that nothing has changed from the books, but I think there's one major change that really shot the show in the foot up front. And that's the disc. This plotline was wholly invented for the show, and it's brought up in multiple episodes throughout the first season. In the very first episode, Elfangor tries to give Tobias an Andalite disc, telling him to guard it with his heart and soul. And Tobias immediately blows it.
Tobias, come on! I have to get it!
That is exactly how it's edited in the show, by the way. The disc is a MacGuffin that, despite being referenced multiple times, is only relevant occasionally, and when it's finally paid off, all it does is give Tobias, who's been trapped in the body of a hawk, his morphing powers back. It also then lets him acquire his own human DNA, allowing him to morph back to human for 2 hours at a time. Now this is kind of unsatisfying. Partly because what makes getting trapped in morph so scary is that Andalites don't know how to undo it, but also partly because Elfangor gives the disc to Tobias before he gets trapped as a hawk. Later, it's also revealed that the disc has a message from Elfangor explaining that he's actually Tobias' father, which that would have been fine on its own. The problem with that is that in the books, Tobias gets his powers back by getting a side quest from the Ellimist to create a hidden colony of free Hork-Bajir on Earth. The Ellimist then rewards him with his powers and human DNA. Now, the show never shies away from portraying the Ellimist, but a Hork-Bajir colony would obviously be a huge expense. And the Hork-Bajir puppets, well, they're no Jim Henson. So this sort of puts the writers in a no-win situation. You can find some other reason for the Ellimist to give Tobias' powers back, which is already pretty silly, or you can make this MacGuffin pull double duty. The disc is one of the biggest plot elements invented for the show, and it's one of the few threads that runs from one episode to another, and I think this gives the impression that the show changed more than it did. It added this huge, weird, unsatisfying plot element, but the show also has to do something. They need a way for Tobias to get his powers back. Tobias couldn't even stay trapped as a hawk in the books for very long, and they could write whatever they wanted. In a TV show, it's even harder. There are only so many times you can cut away to a hawk's glower. They need an excuse to put a human actor back on screen, and apparently a gamer goose god let the bird become a boy just wasn't gonna cut it. I truly don't want to minimize how much the show changes from the books, because if you sat down to write down each and every change, and believe me, I've been trying, you could certainly find tons, but I just don't think that most of those changes add up to a substantially different version of the story, especially when the things the show gets right are very often exactly the kind of things people liked about the books. More importantly, there were much bigger problems with the show, starting with the budget. Alright, we've been dancing around this one for a while, but it's time to talk about the budget for this show, because I think I've invested more on MoviePass than they did on this show, and I got better returns. While there aren't any publicly available specific numbers for how much the Animorphs show cost, we can get an impression of what kind of budget the show had based on its sibling show, Goosebumps. Always comes back to Goosebumps. The 90s Goosebumps show is, in a lot of ways, the prototype for what the Animorphs show would become. It was produced by Deborah Forte, who became president of the newly formed Scholastic Media in 1995. Forte and Scholastic Media's goal was overseeing media productions based on the company's various book series. Much of the Animorphs writing and directing crew was borrowed straight from the Goosebumps production, and both were produced by Canadian television production company Protocol Entertainment. Now, it would be a mistake to call Goosebumps a high-budget show, but as kids shows go, it occasionally had fairly lavish productions. It was able to do this because a couple really detailed prosthetics or some zany sets could go a long way. Animorphs, by comparison, Goosebumps Goosebumps also had an advantage in that if its effects and sets came off as low budget and made it look cheesy, well, that just kind of enhances the vibe, doesn't it? The show often adopted a funhouse, carnival style that lent itself well to a horror anthology for children. Conversely, Animorphs seemed to have a lower budget, or at the very least, if it had a budget, it's less clear where the money went, and to make matters worse, a lack of a budget is more of a glaring problem on Animorphs than it would be in Goosebumps. The Haunted Mask might not have the budget of, say, The Mask, but a pretty good prosthetic for the Haunted Mask is totally fine. Whereas in Animorphs, the Hork-Bajir are supposed to be terrifying monsters that slice open our heroes' internal organs. So, this isn't really cutting it, metaphorically. Honestly, those Hork-Bajir blades are probably not cutting it literally either. Stop making it worse. This budget problem also affects the other big pillar of Animorph stories, the animals. The books have just an absolute shitload of morphing. Most books tend to start with some fun morphing adventure, sometimes not even really all that related to the plot. For example, in the books that the episodes we watched were based on, the kids morphed birds, dogs, or cockroaches at least as early as chapter 2. In their corresponding episodes, they all have scenes that perform the same basic plot function, but usually without morphing.
That's why I feel like the show didn't stick.
Yeah.
Because it couldn't deliver on the stuff that you actually came to read the books for, which is kids turn into animals, they fight aliens as animals.
Or if they did involve morphing, it was without the morphing.
Here, follow me. See? What did I tell you?
Now, sometimes that led to really creative replacement scenes. That excellent scene of Jake tormenting Visser 3 and Tom with snails was almost certainly written to replace the opening scene in the book where Jake morphs a cockroach to spy on Tom. This is a genuinely good addition in my opinion, and it doesn't happen without those budgetary limitations. But this seems like the exception rather than the rule. It is hard to overstate how much these budget constraints really tanked the show. In the Animorphs Bible that Michael Grant shared on Twitter, which I will reiterate from last time, was a haphazard attempt to prove to Scholastic that the authors had a plan at all. The first two are morphing into animals and the bug-eyed aliens. Those two things are both essential to the series and also wildly expensive, especially for a kids show. As we noticed while watching the show, morphing was surprisingly rare, and aliens even more so. Axe and Visser 3 spent way more time in their human morphs than Andalite bodies because making realistic puppets and suits is expensive. Like in that scene with Axe hacking the Blockbuster card, he morphs back to human in the middle of the process because I guess they could only use the Andalite suit for like 2 shots or something, I don't know. Making a good enough puppet and using humans wherever possible, on the other hand, is cheap. When you break it down like this, it seems like most of the controversial choices in the show were driven more by budgetary constraints than creative differences. The Escape doesn't feature a scene of 6 birds carrying a man jumping off a building into a river because how? Like seriously, I'm trying to figure out how I would shoot that myself here in 2021 with advanced technology, and I can't figure out a cheap way to do it that won't look like Birdemic. And I put myself in the Vatican in the intro. Making decisions on a budget is hard, but making decisions on a budget under a time crunch is even harder. Which brings us to the schedule. As we touched on earlier, a lot of the crew for Animorphs came over from Goosebumps. This decision was almost certainly done, at least in part, to retain as much infrastructure from the Goosebumps production as possible, so they could get Animorphs out the door and strike while the iron's hot. And the window to strike that iron wasn't very large. The books first started coming out in June 1996, and the first episode of the series arrived by September 1998. To put that in perspective, when the TV show premiered, only 22 of the eventual 54 books in the main series were out, and by the time the last episode aired in Canada, where it usually aired first, 20 of the main series books were still unpublished, as well as Megamorphs number 4, The Alchemist Chronicles, and Visser. And Game of Thrones fans thought they had it bad. This adaptation schedule has a very laying down the tracks in front of a runaway train feel. Except Animorphs books themselves were also being written month to month, so the issue was even further compounded. A couple episodes even feature plot lines that are in the books, but in books that hadn't been released yet. Most notably, episode 17, which came out in January 1999, seems loosely based on Megamorphs number 4, which wouldn't come out until April 2000. But also, the similarities are pretty superficial. They both feature a very It's a Wonderful Lifestyle alternate reality where things could be different if they hadn't gotten involved in the war, but The things that are different in the show are very different from the ones in the book. In the show, it's the Ellimist that makes an offer to Jake instead of Krayak. Tobias is the one who finds out about the Yeerk invasion instead of Cassie. In the book, Marco is dating Rachel? Oh, and the book ends with the Yeerks switching to all-out war instead of just capturing all the kids like in the show. So in general, I think it's safe to say that while the show might have had some vague idea of what was coming, maybe, it didn't have much specific knowledge of the books ahead of time, which for a series like Goosebumps might have been fine. Those books were anthologies, so each new book was a self-contained story. But as we talked about in the first video, Animorphs is a long-form war story. It is eventually leading to something, and certain plot elements are crucial to the endgame. But if the show doesn't know that, then it might cut elements that are important to the end of the series without realizing it. Or at least it would if the end of the series existed. The Animorphs TV show was canceled in the middle of its second season, with only 6 episodes in that season. Of those 6, only 2 were very clearly based on books. The decision to cancel the show was almost certainly due at least in part to underperformance, but also, what plan do you even have? Most of the books published from January 1999 and onward, which started with book number 25 in the main series, were written by ghostwriters, with K.A. Applegate providing only outlines of the plots. Meanwhile, the second season of the show started to air in September of 1999. That doesn't leave many books that are already written and ready to adapt, and the books that are coming down the pipeline are even more complicated than the ones you've already gotten. The latest book in the series that got adapted into an episode was book number 17. You know, the one with the oatmeal. The next books on the table for adaptation after that are going to be the ones where Cassie traps herself as a caterpillar, the one with the Helmicrons, and the David trilogy. The series is not getting easier to adapt, there's not yet a clear indication of where it's going, and the show writers are increasingly having to make it up as they go along. Most of the long-term plots are only just starting to show up in the books, and frankly, the bigger those stories get, the harder they are to adapt to a TV show. It's honestly shocking that the show lasted as long as it did with this kind of production. It's one thing to be writing a series in real time without much of a plan for where you're heading, but it's another to be writing it in real time while someone else is writing your plan also in real time with none of your budget constraints. That's not to say it would have been impossible to make this series work, but it would have taken masterful execution to accomplish, which, the execution. It's not very good. I want to draw a careful distinction here because I think we have a tendency to flatten what bad means. Making a creative decision that isn't what you personally might want isn't necessarily bad, and decisions that are forced due to budgetary or practical limitations might lead to a less faithful product, but that doesn't always make an adaptation bad. Put another way, it might be impractical to have a ton of scenes of graphic morphing in a 90s kids show, but that doesn't mean that scenes of human kids hanging out are automatically poorly written, shot, or edited. But, to be clear, many of the scenes in the show are poorly written, shot, and edited. The final battle scene in The Escape is a perfect example of this. The story ends in the Yeerk Pool, which is meant to be a sort of hell, an underground lair of anguished screams and torment, as hosts, temporarily freed from the Yeerks, beg and plead for their lives. An impenetrable fortress that is impossible to get into or out of. Even in the show, they have to morph ferrets to dig into the Yeerk Pool. A fight scene here should be scary, intimidating, dreadful, or if you're going to go the kids show route, at least a reasonable approximation of it. However, the people behind the show, well, for starters, they don't really have a good sense of space. In some cases, goons walk right by main characters that they should reasonably see, and the Animorphs just kind of hang out right in the open. It's not that every single minor eyeline error is a problem, but like, who the hell are these people standing right behind Jake? Or Rachel? Are they hidden at all? Are they even trying to hide? Like, are we supposed to assume everyone else believes they're also controllers? Walking around suspiciously with water balloons? This goes beyond technical mistakes and it becomes poor storytelling. It becomes hard to follow what you're supposed to be feeling during the scene because you're not sure what's happening. You're told that this is a scary place where the heroes can't be spotted, but they look like they're being spotted all the time. So it's no longer shocking when one of them gets spotted for real. The show also makes prolific use of slow motion, and when I say that, I mean playing back footage recorded normally at a slower frame rate. I won't get too technical here, but the short version is that this show was most likely recorded at 29.97 frames per second. If you wanted to shoot slow motion footage for this show, you would want to record more frames than that per second. say, 60. Then you would play that back at 29.97 frames per second. This would create slow motion footage that's still as smooth as all the other shots. Instead, whether because the show's cameras weren't capable of shooting at a higher frame rate, or they simply didn't know that they could, what they did do is take normal footage and just play it back slower, which gives this almost slideshow effect. It doesn't look good, and the show does it all the time. They also completely undercut the tension in the scene due to what is most likely poor planning. In this scene, Rachel falls into the yerk pool, which other stories, even in the show, convey as a very bad thing. Your first thought is going to be, oh no, a yerk is going to get in her ear. A reasonable assumption, since that's exactly what happens to Jake in the capture, when he falls into a much smaller yerk pool for much less time. In this episode, however, this is how they convey that Rachel managed to escape the pool.
You can't escape, you know that, don't you?
It's okay, Jake.
All your foolish plans for nothing.
I made it out.
And I guess we're just supposed to trust her implicitly. I need to emphasize, it's okay if Rachel escaped by, say, morphing into some animal and slinking away out of the pool without being noticed, but in this case, you kinda have to show it. I've given a lot of leeway to the show for budgetary, practical, or scheduling limitations, but this is just not good. The best case scenario here is that they shot footage of Rachel somehow getting out of the pool, but that for whatever reason it didn't work, so they had to record some audio lines to cover it. Jake doesn't even seem to be reacting to this line, so it doesn't seem like this edit was intended in the first place. But it's really hard to tell because the way the footage is shot and edited is just, it's competent at best, and sometimes not even that. I don't want to be overly cruel to people when I don't know the circumstances they were working under, but I do think it's important to highlight that this stuff matters. The camera and editor have immense power to influence how you feel about a scene. For example, a scene where human and Hork-Bajir controllers fire lasers at the Animorphs as they flee could be a really cool scene when you describe it, but if the result is just a bunch of disconnected shots of people holding flashlights in slideshow slow-mo, it's just not gonna land. The characterization. Now, despite all the other issues with the show, I have to admit, the characters are pretty dead on a lot of the time. Jake is still a put-upon leader, Marco is a cynical strategist hiding behind a plucky comic relief, Rachel is still the first to rush into battle, and Cassie is still the necessary conscience of the team. Many of the plots that demonstrate these aspects of the character haven't even been written yet, so it's a bit fair that we don't get too much depth for each of these. But there's one character that got done dirty because it wasn't really possible to do him any other way. Axe. In My Name is Eric, the show adds an element of his character, aside from his nipples, that isn't in the books. An odd TV mimicking bit. Which does make me laugh every time, but I imagine it's an extension of the budget problems with presenting Axe as a full Andalite. In the books, Axe is frequently in his natural form, where he typically has a calm, level-headed, almost Spockian demeanor, but it's only when he morphs into a human, something he does much less often in the books, that he starts to become sillier, usually by losing his goddamn mind around food, or by playing with mouth sounds. Which, on that last bit...
We'll be right back.
Nice touch. But showing Axe's Andalite form in the show is way more difficult. Your options are either put a guy in a giant suit, use an even gianter puppet, or do close-up shots of smaller puppets, which is how you get disconcerting, unconnected shots like this.
Did you find them?
No, sir! Just a couple of dogs!
Get those dogs, you fool! They might be Andalites!
Without the budget to overcome this hurdle, you don't have a lot of good options, so having Axe morph to human makes sense. It's a better way to hide an alien anyway. The idea that Axe just hangs out in the woods as a blue centaur scorpion without getting spotted was always a bit of a stretch, and it's easy to handwave away that Axe remorphs every couple of hours. Thing is, this creates a new problem. Now you need something for human Axe to do. Just having him stand around stoically expositing Andalite culture would be, first, a waste of Paulo Costanzo's excellent physical acting skills.
A joke. I see.
But it would also come off as very dry and uninteresting. The show's default way of solving this problem is usually by showing him trying to figure out human culture, which can be very tropey, but there are times it works really well, and even, perhaps accidentally, works well as a way to explore neurodivergence. Like this bit from the episode The Front, where Axe tries to buy a boombox and is told that it costs $250.
What? I gave him money. He said $250. I gave him $250. What?
He meant $250.
Your Earth language is very imprecise.
Like, this is a pretty good moment. It's based on a similar scene in book number 18, The Decision, where Axe tries to get a job in order to trade money for delicious buns. But the scene in the show speaks to a more relatable misunderstanding. I've been that person who misunderstood something because I took it too literally, and then I got frustrated that I was in trouble because other people were, at least from my perspective, not speaking clearly. The TV mimicking bit is, by comparison, less relatably neurodivergent. It's more zany 90s goofball sidekick. It's not that Axe wasn't silly in Human Morph in the books, but he didn't go quite this far, which is fine. I still think it's funny, and while it's kind of a distraction from the plot, we've already talked about why that plot from the book probably wasn't going to happen anyway. But Axe's character does suffer from not being able to counteract these goofy moments with more grounded, serious scenes as a natural Andalite. The individual choices to avoid expensive puppets and suits, which would not look good in the first place, and instead focus on the human culture angle, are all fine in isolation. Like, you see how they made that decision, but they end up coming at the expense of other aspects of Axe's character, ultimately reducing him more often to a punchline than a fully fleshed out character. It becomes a bad adaptation of Axe, not because what they choose to show was super unfaithful to the books, most of the time, but because what they weren't able to show is just as important as what they were. Overall, this feels like death by 1,000 Helmicrons. Without a proper budget, limited by the technology of its time, and racing to create a show as the book it's based on is still being written, the Animorphs show just wasn't really set up for success. And it doesn't totally help that some of the people shooting and editing the show just weren't able to produce very good work. However, most of these issues are circumstantial. I think it's important to recognize that when properly contextualized, some of the creative decisions that the show made do make sense. Where possible, the show frequently chose to retain as much of the books as it could, especially some of the more complex moral issues or serious, tough emotional scenes, which I expected to be the first things on the chopping block. Sometimes I was right. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it didn't have to be a perfect adaptation. In fact, even treating it as an adaptation is misplacing its position in history a bit. Because remember, the show was coming out alongside the books, and Scholastic Media's goal with these productions was just as much to promote those books as it was to create TV shows. So, from a certain point of view, this wasn't really a TV show. It was an advertisement. Part 5. The tie-ins. After everything we've looked at so far, there are two obvious questions. Why rush out the series while the books are still being written, and why do it with such a low budget? The answer to both of these questions is to sell shit. As we talked about in the previous video, Goosebumps was a golden calf for Scholastic, increasing their annual revenue by close to $500 million between 1992 and 1996. Notably, 1992 is the year the first Goosebumps book started publishing, and 1996 is when the first season of the Goosebumps TV show ended. In other words, why fix what ain't broke? Goosebumps came out monthly, sold at book fairs, and had a TV show that got kids hooked. Why not try the same thing with Animorphs? Now, I'm not saying that's a good idea, especially since I have the benefit of hindsight, but Animorphs, both the book series and the show, came out at a unique point in time right before other YA novel series that had longer but fewer entries would come to dominate the young adult literary landscape. There is, in some alternate timeline, a version of history where Animorphs never got a TV show, which means fewer people find out about it, the books don't sell as well, and it possibly ends up even more obscure than it already is. At this point, you're probably having one of two reactions to what I just said. Either A, who the hell is discovering Animorphs through the TV show and not the books? Can't blame you for that one. That was my thought too. Or you're one of the many people who showed up in the comments of my past two videos to say, actually, I found the show first. And that's kind of the point, right? Scholastic Media very intentionally made a show, aired it on YTV in Canada and Nickelodeon in the US, in order to put the franchise in front of kids' eyeballs so that they could then say, now, go read the books. That was always the goal. Of course some people discovered the show first. And you know what? I'm cool with that. If a TV show led to kids reading more, that's a win in my book. Plus, I'm kind of a fan of this series, in case it's not obvious. And I'd rather more people read it. The morally nuanced stories, the inventive sci-fi elements, and even the vivid, gruesome fight scenes all make for a worthwhile read. Plus, you know how many people saw those covers and skipped these books? People with absolutely no taste? Look at this. Look at it. This is art. The point is, this, or really any new series, needs as much help as it can get reaching a new audience. So while I'm not necessarily a fan of how poorly executed the TV show was at times, I can appreciate that when a 90s kid flipped over to Nickelodeon and saw that Animorphs intro, they could sit back and get a taste of what the book series had to offer and... Wait, hold up. Is that fucking Beast Wars? It is! That's Optimus Primal, and Cheetor, and motherfucking Dinobot! This is the very first scene of the first episode of the show. What the hell is this doing here? Come on. You know the answer at this point. It's cross-promotion. See, Beast Wars, the best piece of Transformers media to ever grace the airwaves, don't even start with me, was coming out right around the same time as Animorphs. Specifically, Beast Wars' third season was airing alongside Animorphs' first season. Why is that particular fact relevant? Well, because Beast Wars Season 3 is when the series introduced the Transmetals 2 line. These were versions of the characters with mangled, asymmetrical bodies of flesh and metal. Like every new season of the show, new character designs meant a new accompanying toy line. However, unlike previous years, which each featured around 20 plus unique models, the Transmetals 2 line of toys only had about 17, because the rest of the lineup was filled out with Animorphs Transformers. These toys functioned like regular Transformers, but instead featured the various Animorphs reconfiguring into the animals they morph into. Or whatever, cause like Jake transforms into a grizzly bear, Rachel turns into a lion. Like, at least that last one happened in the show, but who cares? It's fine, never mind, it's fine. These toys were sold on shelves right next to the Transmetals 2 line of Beast Wars toys, and it should be emphasized, this was kind of a big deal. Several of the Beast Wars toys that year were redecos, that is, versions of previous toys that kept the same shape, but are recolored or have their appearances slightly changed in order to form a new product. This happened because making new molds was a much more expensive process, so every new mold in the lineup was a calculated, costly affair, which makes it wild that Hasbro lent out slots in its Beast Wars lineup to whatever the hell this is. Like, they're not even good. I've got one here. See this? You know what this is? Go ahead, take a guess what the hell this is supposed to be. This is Visser 3. I mean, he's evil, so we obviously have to make him red or something. I have no idea. And because they have to morph from humans into animals, and not robots, which would be much easier to design, their human forms look like someone found David Cronenberg's leftovers in a thrift shop. It's weird though how much Animorphs and Beast Wars were intertwined, despite not having any story connection. They were more spiritual and commercial siblings. The Beast Wars toy lineup promotes the Animorphs TV show, the Animorphs TV show promotes the Beast Wars show, and hopefully leads kids back to the Animorphs books to read, which they're probably going to get from a Scholastic book fair, where they're probably going to find Goosebumps books. And okay, at this point I really have to ask, what the hell are we doing? Like, collectively, as a society. I'm nowhere near the first person to point out that Ronald Reagan's FCC brought on a wave of deregulation that allowed children's programming to be more explicitly commercial. Cartoons, especially starting in the 1980s, were often thinly veiled ads for toy lineups, with story elements driven more by which new toys were coming out rather than any kind of narrative cohesion. And this is how far down that rabbit hole we were just by the late 90s. An Ouroboros of animal transforming into humanoid thing media, cross-promoting themselves at every vector in the hopes that somewhere along the way, some kid will ask their parents to buy something, even if it's a book. I feel like this is the part where I'm supposed to get cynical. Realize that I've been living in a capitalist matrix that's been programming me with cheaply made media in an attempt to give me a lifelong primal desire to buy their shit. Which is true, but also, this is now the third straight hour I've spent talking about what Animorphs meant to me. And it's clear that the authors of the books, and even some of the people working on the show, wanted to make something meaningful. And same, I'm making YouTube videos because I hope that the ad revenue, or those ramen dudes, or the many attractive, powerful people on my Patreon will give me more money so I can pay my bills. But I still want to do it while making something that people get something out of and that I can feel proud of. It's a nice sentiment, but come on. Maybe I could make the argument that Animorphs snuck some deep, interesting plot lines into its book series for kids. Maybe I could make the argument that some of that came through on a TV show and at least it got kids to read. But come on, it's not like Beast Wars is Shakespeare or anything. Next time we're talking about how Beast Wars is Shakespeare. All right, that is it. We did Animorphs 3. The trilogy is done. I think that's going to be the last Animorphs video I do for a while. I wouldn't say never. Like, I might do something whenever the movie comes out, but I think that's about all I have to say about Animorphs right now. Like I said in the video, Beast Wars is going to be next. It is not literally going to be the next video. I actually need to do some smaller things, go easier on myself between now and then, but in near-ish soon, sometime future, Beast Wars is going to be another one of these big videos. I got a lot to explore in that one. I have a small video I think I'm going to do next. It's going to be a little bit different from the video essay format, but it's just going to be an experiment to kind of fill the time. But yeah, and hopefully it'll be silly. Like, this is, by the way, another one of the scenes I've done. These are my terrible skeleton children. It was a lot of fun putting together these models. They're just look at them waving around. I want to extend a huge thank you to the people on my Patreon. Some of you have been subscribed for a while, even though I don't put out too many videos. In particular, I want to thank Bibliotechnophile, Carla Carroll, Deanna Ogle, Finn Flaherty, H. Irving, Ian Fade, Jake Colborn, Robert Green, and Thalon. All of you are wonderful. Thank you so much for helping me to continue to do this. Also, sometime, I think this week, I'm going to put up some VFX breakdowns. I'm going to do some blog posts, so you can probably find those on my Twitter. I'm going to explain how I did some of these. And I think that'll be fun. And thank you so much for watching. See you next time.